I'm the sector manager for urban and water, so I'm basically responsible for making sure that the World Bank's support to sub-Saharan Africa on issues of urban and on issues of water and sanitation are delivered to the clients on time, that I facilitate global exchanges, that I facilitate investments in both the urban sector and the water and sanitation sector. One caveat, when I say water and sanitation, it's the water distribution that I'm focused on, not the water resource side. Probably the biggest challenge is access. How do you ensure access to as many people as possible? You know, our goal really is universal access to water and sanitation, that every household, every household, both in rural and in urban areas, have access to improved and improving water and sanitation systems. So that's probably the biggest goal. But it's, in some sense, that's the objective. Why is it that we don't have universal access? And if you take an analysis of that, you begin to see that it's not really a question of resources, it's not really a question of technology or capacity, although resources, technology, and capacity matter. It's really about the political underpinnings of the institutions that deliver water and sanitation. Are these institutions accountable to the citizens? If they're not accountable to the citizen, it's going to be very hard to ensure access to water on a universal scale. Well, I think the solution to delivery of water and sanitation is not one silver bullet, not one size fits all. So if you go to rural areas with a lot of dispersed households in villages, you won't be able to establish a network system of delivery, you know, what you and I are used to in a city. There, communities have to get together to manage water. Communities and even at the household level. So in Bangladesh, for example, the availability of tube wells at a household level is very important. In other areas, it's communities getting together and managing the water wells. And in some places, communities getting together and managing small pipe water systems. So where you have low density settlements, clearly community-based systems are very important. But when you come to the dense urban settlements, it's not really community-based systems that will deliver universal access to services. It's how your water utility functions. It's how your water agency functions. Now, mind you, that doesn't mean community does not have a role. As I mentioned earlier, it's about accountability to citizens. So in the case of these, if you will, large water utilities, it's making sure that the utility responds to the needs of communities, but you don't expect communities to run the utilities. So a big difference. Communities, yes, in dispersed areas, but certainly in dense urban areas, you're talking about water utilities and reforming water utilities. But in both cases, whoever does the provision has to be accountable to the citizen for the system to work. When I talk about accountability to citizens, in many ways, that's talking about the local problem and a local solution. Climate change is a global problem and requires a global solution. Because of climate change impact, most African cities and village areas are facing the problems of adaptation. Let me give you one example. Coastal cities. Across Africa, we're now beginning to see coastal cities face far more flooding and more prone to vulnerabilities of nature. So clearly in those areas, delivering water and sanitation must deal with making cities far more climate resilient. African cities are not the cause of the problem of climate change. Most of them are actually facing the brunt of the climate change changes that are happening. So one example is how do you manage coastal cities? On the other hand, you also have the degradation of forests, the degradation of natural resources, which is really the basis of agriculture. And if that is not reversed, you're going to see tremendous amount of poverty, and you're going to see far more pressure on systems across Africa. But that's if you will, a global challenge to water and sanitation, one which we did not address or did not see 10, 15 years ago. But ultimately, even the global issue is about accountability. Who is accountable for contributing to global problems, and what are the type of global institutions that can address these problems? Who's accountable for that? So I'm someone who's a very strict believer in looking at problems of development through the lens of accountability, which means the relationship between government, the providers, and citizens, and who responds to whom. And I think that most of the systems we deal with around the world are systems that are not responsive to citizens. Similarly, on global issues, are global institutions responding to citizens? That accountability, I think, is also very important. Well, here too, I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think water can be delivered through public operators, it can be delivered through public-private partnerships, it can be delivered through community-based organization. I don't think ownership of the operation is the issue. The issue is whoever is the owner, do we have systems that holds that operator accountable? So let me give you an example. A public provider, if it's not arm's length from government, where government is both the owner and the regulator and the policymaker, where's the check and balance? So in a public system, what you want to make sure is that the city, if that's the owner of the water utility, has an arm's length relationship with the water provider. So the water provider has some autonomy to deliver. That way, the city policymakers can hold the water provider accountable. Similarly, if you bring in a private operator into the system, you want to make sure that that private operator is accountable both to the government as well as to the citizen. So it's not really the ownership that I would say we should focus on. We should really focus on whether the institution has checks and balances around it, and clearly checks and balances that enhance the citizen's role in holding the provider accountable. I think we often talk about water and forget sanitation, and if you look at about the advances that we have seen around the world, more and more cities, more and more villages moving towards 24/7 access to water, but sanitation remains a problem. And changing behaviors about sanitation, getting people to invest in latrines, getting people to have a different hygiene behavior requires a very different approach. In rural areas, it's about, if you will, supporting a change, a shift in thinking about sanitation. It's important, it's health impact. In cities, the demand for sanitation is there. In rural areas, the demand isn't there because people go out in the open. It's trying to get them to shift from going out into the open and investing in their own latrines. In cities, it's about space because you have dense slum areas where people just can't invest in a latrine even though they want it. So the whole issue of building the change process in sanitation will require far more effort, and I think quite a bit of effort in changing minds rather than just simply working on institutions.